40% Merlot. 40%
Oh, it's
Welcome to the Wine Enthusiast Podcast, the world in your glass.
This episode is brought to you by Blue Apron. Blue Apron, the company that made home cooking cool again, now has an even better reason to stay in. Incredible wines delivered to your door. From Bordeaux to Napa to New Zealand, some of the world's best winemakers work exclusively with Blue Apron wine. Get $25 off your first shipment of 6 wines at blueapron.com/corkscrew. Hi, I'm Dylan Garret, Associate Digital Editor and recovering bartender over at Wine Enthusiast Magazine, and I'm here with our Spirits Editor, Kara Newman. We're at the Brandy Library in the Tribeca neighborhood of New York City, ready to trade in our wine glasses for rocks glasses as we talk about one of our other favorite alcoholic beverages, whiskey. We're currently settled into a couple of plush leather sofas, literally surrounded on all sides by countless bottles of some of the finest spirits in the world, just covering every surface imaginable here. Literally what my apartment looks like in my imagination if I won the lottery and had any sort of sense of taste when it comes to interior design. The after-work crowd is already filtering in. We've got a fantastic soundtrack of jazz and big band to go with some boulevardiers they just put in front of us, and we'll soon be talking with the Brandy Library's owner, Flavien Desoblin, about how whiskey has shaped this bar's path over the years. He also teaches classes here on the subject that have become quite popular, and later on we'll also be chatting with Clay Risen, author and spirits writer for the New York Times, who has an upcoming book on Scotch he'll tell you about, along with his take on the future of whiskey and general revelry. So hopefully you're in a position to pour a couple of fingers of the good stuff for yourself while you listen along, because it's not nearly as much fun to talk about whiskey as it is to drink it.
Flavien Desoblin, Brandy Library and Copper and Oak owner.
So we're here at Brandy Library. We are sitting here in the middle of these beautiful shelves full of brandy, of course, and plenty of whiskey. And this is actually one of the places I came first when I moved to New York and started learning about whiskey. What made you decide to start the Brandy Library?
Well, in a nutshell, the market had a need for education along with the service of the more fancy spirits. But back then it was really just single malt Scotch whiskey. So I wanted to make it a lot broader, and nobody really knew what brandy was. The general public did not know. Single malt Scotch, of course, rang everybody's ears, but brandy, people thought it was just brown spirits or fine spirits. So for me, it was kind of a catch-all name. And it's really just out of realizing that so many people wanted to drink well and could drink a few and at a high price, but needed to know. So there was this growing in-the-know clientele. And that was a very simple proposal, and actually it's been working ever since.
So what do you say to people who come in and don't know much about whiskey? How do you guide them?
Well, clearly we start by telling them that there's a huge variety of whiskeys. And just like brandy, it's only an umbrella term, and there's certainly a whiskey for every occasion and every palate. And we always try to get some of their background first, whether they're wine drinkers or beer drinkers, if they had an experience with Scotch, for example, or bourbon in the past, and from there we take them on, say, a bourbon and rye path or a non-peated Scotch path. Usually we'd keep it in the single grain or blended grain if it had to be a soft entry into the Scotch category, just to make sure that the easy notes of vanilla and caramel and butterscotch would please them, because it's really hard to not like all that. And then we build in the different maturation styles. It seems to be both an easy approach and one that makes a lot of sense for all, to talk about the ex-bourbon cask and the ex-sherry cask and the use or not of peat during the malting of the barley when it comes to Scotch whiskey. And then for bourbon and Japanese whiskeys, we've got different approaches. But for Scotch, which still represents a large chunk of the whiskey consumption here, this is our approach, and it's been working very well.
What do you look for when you're trying to guide someone who's not necessarily familiar with whiskey? If I was a customer, one of our listeners who loved, let's say, a very bold, dark California Zinfandel, what would you think when it comes to suggesting a whiskey for them?
So we'd go into the deep, the rich, almost hurtful, and I don't say it in any negative way, but a cask strength rye whiskey, a first fill sherry butt matured single malt, a bourbon that's been matured for maybe a little too long on top floors of those rick houses in Kentucky.
Is there any particular trends that you see here at Brandy Library that are influencing what you're looking for, what you're buying, or anything recently that you've gotten in and said, I don't think I'm stocking this one, this is going into the private collection?
Well, trends, even though everybody is always quite open to anything whiskey, they're far from taking over, but brandies in general are getting there. I mean, Armagnac is just getting so much traction now, and it's still so affordable. The younger generation is waking up to it like it's the last pot of gold. So, but keeping in the world of whiskey in general, of course, Japanese whiskey is all the rage, and we can't have enough of it. It's a little tough because we can't supply our customers with enough of that. And but we make sure to give the education and to guarantee that people know it's not all amazing, and they shouldn't just be drinking anything Japanese, right? So that's important. Now I think is the time to realize that this is a world with a great variety of styles and price points and values. When it comes to Scotch whiskey, I want to say that a couple of years ago the trend for peat had slowed down, and now it's coming back up. Now they want more peat again. So it seems to be in sort of waves when it comes to trends for peated Scotch. But now, peated Scotch is high again. Only you can't just present any sort of peated Scotch. It's got to have something in the background. It's got to give the personality of the distillery. Otherwise, they just don't buy it and they think, it's just another smoky Scotch, right? The American malts are probably still a thing of bar owners and industry-related liking. I think it's going to take another few years for the consumers to really enjoy a category that's still in the building outside of a couple of big brands. But certainly it's fantastic to see what Westland, for example, is doing. But American malt is becoming a category on its own. That's beautiful. That's what the market needs. Another category, actually. Otherwise, the finishing is almost assumed, and that's a little bit of a problem, I think. Every Scotch drinker wants to know what it is finished in. Like it's the in their mind, this is what makes a final product. When up until a few years ago, a few distilleries were doing this, but it was certainly not part of the DNA. Now, they'd even look down at a whiskey if it's not finished in something, and we see most distilleries using those finishes, or actually maybe mentioning them now. And I think it's a bit wrong. It's a bit wrong of doing so, because there's so much. There's such a variety of takes on the finishing, from a month in a barrel that's been used so many times to first fill barrel for 6 months. I think it has become a catch-all phrase, and really just marketing is using this to justify a higher price. So that's not good.
There's so many exciting whiskeys from around the world. I just heard about one from India today that I hadn't heard of before. There's whiskey from South Africa. There's whiskey from New Zealand that just crossed my path. I mean, it's a whole brave new whiskey world out there.
And that's really thanks to the new generation of drinkers, thanks to the basically the 25, 30-year-old currently being open-minded and being aware of everything. They know it can be a great whiskey wherever it comes from. So it's beautiful for us. It's like, okay, that's it. It's been almost 13 years of waiting for this, and now it's happening, because they don't see any whiskey with a negative preconception. So that's perfect.
Can I ask you, for the classes, when you sit all these people down in a room and you're kind of walking them through Scotch from nuts to bolts, how do you like to start and guide them on their whiskey journey?
Well, we actually make sure to liquor them up before they sit down, so they're getting an easy introduction to the category with either a highball or what we call a mix-it. It's just a little bit of a syrup with a Scotch or Japanese whiskey, whatever it is, with a couple ice cubes and with some food. Then we sit them down and we gauge the crowd to see who's drinking what, and then from there, knowing how much they know, we build on. Sometimes we spend the first 5 minutes to go over the very basics, because it's clear that some of them are not up there yet, and then we actually go into the technical stuff, because they want to know how many gallons a bourbon will expand in volume between 40 degrees Fahrenheit to 120 degrees Fahrenheit of a temperature swing. They really dig this. So, but it's got to be entertaining, so we make them laugh, and we make sure that after 7 whiskeys they don't remember the whole night, so we do it again soon enough. But we always make sure that there's a large part of the education, so to speak, on the wood, on the importance of oak and what the difference is in between the oak species and the styles of maturations and the climatic conditions and all that are doing to the overall final profile of it. When needed, we show them a video of the barrel making. We show them some diagrams of distillation and all that, but no PowerPoint presentation, nothing annoying, nothing boring.
Let you get to your class. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Flavien.
That's an empty glass. It's not right.
This episode is brought to you by Blue Apron. Blue Apron, the company that made home cooking cool again, now offers amazing wines for just $10 per bottle. Each month, you get 6 different wines, many of which would cost twice as much in the store. Not subscribing to Blue Apron meals? Not a problem. These wines taste sublime with whatever you're cooking for dinner. That's why each bottle comes with easy tips on food pairings, so you don't just drink like an enthusiast, you drink like an expert. Get $25 off your first shipment at blueapron.com/corkscrew. Terms and conditions apply. All orders are handled by Blue Apron Wine, Napa, California.
My name is Clay Risen. I write about spirits for the New York Times, and I am the author of American Whiskey, Bourbon, and Rye, a guide to the nation's favorite spirit, and I am working on a book about single malt Scotch.
How long have you actually been doing the spirits beat at the Times now?
So I edit op-eds, and then I write about spirits and pretty much whatever I want to say, which is wonderful. So, I just had a piece on regionalization of American whiskey and focused on an effort here in New York to create a standard by which rye producers in particular would essentially be not required but could buy into a regional identity. And it's cool that it's happening here in New York, and New York's really a leader with that kind of thing, with craft spirits laws and with the industry generally. But you're seeing it around the country where people are doing things to say, you can make bourbon anywhere, and you can make rye anywhere, and you can make single malt anywhere, but what is it about our place that makes it special? So how do you define an American single malt in the Pacific Northwest that may be different from what you might make in Texas or in New York? It's a lot like beer, where you just kind of had a wave of everyone's got a microbrewery and everyone's doing the craft thing, and suddenly everyone's doing the craft thing. So what does it mean to have a Pacific Northwest style of beer or a West Coast style of IPA that might differentiate it from what someone would make in New England?
I mean, so what's the difference? I know you were talking about Empire Rye, New York Rye in your piece. I mean, is there a flavor profile that says this is a New York whiskey?
Well, so there are kind of two things. One is the standards that on one level just elevate and kind of create strictures to age it longer, to put it into the barrel at a lower proof, sort of requiring people to be a little more conscious of what they're making. And the big thing really is that it also requires you to use New York rye, in this case, New York grain generally. And it takes advantage of a trend that's already going on, which you find in all kinds of culinary pursuits. People really paying attention to where their products are coming from and taking advantage of local traditions and reevaluating what their terroir is, whether it's with food or with drink, and drawing on things that people have done with wine for a long time, starting to say, well, what does it mean to grow a particular varietal of rye? And what's exciting to see is that people are saying yes to that, not just in New York, but in the Pacific Northwest, in Texas, in the Southeast, starting to really pay attention to the possibility that something that had been treated like a commodity before, rye, corn, wheat, you just get it on the spot market anywhere, and it all is kind of the same thing. You know, that maybe it makes a difference if it's grown in a particular region, in a particular soil, under certain climatic conditions, that even after you distill it and age it, that it's going to produce a different spirit than if you made it exactly the same way, but using rye from California or from Montana.
Do you find in the current market here in America that it's now a majority of producers who are using, locally grown ingredients, or are people still kind of buying things across the state line as far as the bulk producers go?
Well, the fact remains that 95% of this whiskey, in this case, out there is made by the big establishment distillers. What I think is encouraging is that some of these distillers, and particularly Jim Beam, are paying more attention to this kind of varietal and going back to a way that whiskey was made a long time ago. Part of it is also market driven. It used to be enough to say, hey, we're one of the only craft distilleries in the Southwest. Up until recently, there weren't that many. Now, all of a sudden, there are dozens. So how do you say, well, this is what we're doing that's different, both to differentiate yourself from the big guys and from craft distillers elsewhere, but also from the Johnny-come-latelys around you? How do you say, well, no, what we're doing is not just bourbon. We're using local grains, and maybe you're smoking it over mesquite that you source locally. And you're creating something that can only be made in your region.
What are your thoughts on the new range of American single malts? I'm excited by a lot of them.
I'm really excited. It's something that, if you look back at the deep history of American craft distilling in the 80s and 90s, the first things being made were single malts, because they were generally by people who had a decent amount of money, who really liked whiskey, and at the time, bourbon was not cool. And so they were looking at Scotch as the source. So in some ways, this tradition has been around for a while, but then bourbon became hot, and rye became hot, and then a second generation, and it really was a generational, distillers starting to say, well, what if we did a single malt, and to differentiate ourselves from what everyone else is doing, and also because it's fun. There are all kinds of things to play with. And a lot of people sort of worked from the premise of beer and saying, if you make a beer, and instead of adding hops, you distill it, and then you age it, that's a single malt. And we also don't have the strictures that you have in Scotland, so we can call it a single malt regardless of whether it meets a Scotch malt or a Scotch Whisky Association definition. So there's all kinds of cool things that are being done. And so that's the appeal. What I think is really fun to watch is that these distillers who 5 or 6 years ago were just kind of getting started with it, a good number of them have really come through and made some beautiful, wonderful whiskeys of late, like Westland or House Spirits or Balcones. and they say, you know what? Let's try something totally different because we just want to play around with it. And if you want to call that single malt or you want to call it whatever, we don't care because we're going to have fun and we're going to make something we think is pretty tasty and different. And it's one of the really exciting things about craft distilling that over the last decade, or even less than a decade really, you've seen whiskey distillers who started with an idea that was different and maybe a little weird, maybe just not something, and a lot of them didn't work out, let's be honest, but that people were willing to take a risk and say, yeah, what if we just took a commercial beer and we distilled it and we stuck it in a barrel and we sold that as a whiskey? What about that? It's to see that sort of thing play out and to be successful and delicious. It's just, it's life affirming, to be honest.
Was there ever a moment for you, whether you were working on a story or sitting around a bar watching someone order a drink and thought, man, like this is the turning point. Someone's asking for something that I'm not used to seeing. This isn't a Jack and Coke world anymore.
Probably not one moment. I was working on a story, or I started thinking about a story about the demand for American spirits in Europe, and started talking to boutique importers in London and Paris and Germany who were starting to look at American spirits and not importing huge amounts. No one was making bank on importing craft distillers from the United States. But even this was 4 years ago, and the feedback from the distributors, but really the bartenders over in London and Paris and Berlin saying, yeah, we want to get in on this thing. We think that American craft spirits are where it's at. For me, that was this kind of validating moment for a distributor and a bartender to say, you know, we don't want this stuff that we can always get. We want that from Chicago. That to me was a turning point where that signaled, I think things are really here to stay.
So, Clay, you're currently working on a book about Scotch whiskey, and that's one of the most popular categories out there and one that people always want to learn more about. What should people know about Scotch whiskey? How would you introduce somebody to Scotch?
So one of the reasons I wanted to write the book was that even though Scotch is very popular in the United States, it has this kind of stigma about it, or a stereotype that A, it's for rich people, and B, it's really hard to understand. And neither of those is true. Yes, there are $100,000 bottles out there. And yes, there are some incredibly arcane aspects to Scotch. But when it comes down to it, you can also go to Trader Joe's and buy a bottle of single malt branded by Trader Joe's that is one of the best values on the market. And you can go get a Glen Murray, which is a beautiful distillery within the city limits of Elgin, right there in Speyside. You can go get a Glen Murray for $25-$30. And Glen Murray makes beautiful whiskeys. There's so many whiskeys that whatever your price point is, you can have a pretty good single malt. Now, you can go up from there, but it's absolutely not the case that you have to spend 3 paychecks to get a decent bottle of whiskey. And so that was one thing. And the other is that it's not complicated. It's not complex. I am freaked out by French wine. It scares me. I don't get it. I love wine.
To be fair, me too.
Yeah.
I don't think I should be saying that.
But the number of times that I have tried to sit down and say, okay, this year I'm going to learn French wine, and I have been turned away by my wallet, by my eyeballs, by just my brain size. Scotch isn't like that. There aren't that many Scotches out there. There aren't that many categories. What's beautiful about it is that it's fairly simple to get into, and then it opens up from there. So part of the book was really to start with that and to say, particularly to an American audience, this is not intimidating, it's not expensive, it's something that everybody should be able to appreciate.
Speaking of red wine and non-red wines too, can we talk a bit about all these wine-finished whiskeys that are coming out?
Yeah, it's cool. Traditionally, largely for convenience reasons in the 19th century, a lot of Scotch was aged in sherry barrels because sherry was enormously popular, and you'd get these barrels, these shipping barrels that would arrive in Scotland or the UK, and people didn't have a use for them except let's age our spirits in them. So you associate sherry and to some extent port and some other fortified wines from the continent with Scotch. But what you're seeing now is people starting to branch beyond that and to say, well, it doesn't have to be sherry. It doesn't have to be port. It can be Chardonnay. Glen Murray, they make a Chardonnay finished Scotch, which is beautiful. And also, by the way, is less than $50 a bottle. It's a wonderful thing. And there are a couple other distilleries that are either owned by French companies or have an affinity one way or the other with wineries. And they're starting to play around with that connection. And this goes to marketing as well. It's a great opportunity to say, here's something different. Here's a whiskey that is aged in French Chardonnay or some other white wine or red wine. In fact, right now I'm drinking a Talisker Distiller's Edition that's finished in Amoroso barrels. It's beautiful. It's such a perfect, and you wouldn't think Talisker. You think of Talisker as having almost a peaty, very, very saline, very, very kind of thick turtleneck standing against the waves. Wind in your face.
I love this description.
Sorry, can we just do this for the next 30 minutes? Because I'm pretty sure we could sell that as an audiobook on Amazon.
Exactly. But you take that and you put it in this Italian wine barrel that's just this beautiful, supple wine barrel, and it makes for the color on it is just, I don't know if you can see it. Sorry for those at home, you
lovely.
cannot
it's
see
dark.
it. But I would recommend if you're ever in a store and you see it, you don't have to buy it, but just look at the color of this Talisker is beautiful, and it makes for this unexpectedly wonderful mixture of both that seaside sort of pursuit fisherman sort of whiskey and this wonderful sort of vineyard softness. And the more distillers play around with this, I think the more fun and the broader the category becomes.
Do you feel like you've noticed that Scotch producers who've been, kind of traditionally by the book, very strict set of rules for producing, are kind of being influenced by American producers now as far as reaching out and experimenting with different barrels? Is it more just a general trend of people willing to reach a little further now?
I think part of it is generational in that you now have a younger generation of master distillers and executives and people throughout a company who are coming around and saying, we're willing to throw the book out and try something new. But yeah, absolutely, different markets are influencing each other. This is the good side of having international ownership. At the same time, I think you're right that the American market and the desire in the United States for bourbon being the thing, is definitely having an influence back on the continent and back in Scotland. Everyone, I think, learns something from the beer experience, where you have big beer that didn't see craft coming. And even when it saw craft beer coming, ignored it. And all of a sudden, you had a category that was nowhere in terms of volume in the late 90s. Suddenly, within a decade, had 16-20% of the market. And now, most of the growth is in craft, and the big guys are flatlining. And bourbon, learning from that and saying, you know what, let's not wait until every craft producer out there making craft whiskey is capturing market share and capturing all the growth in market share. Let's start to innovate and do cool stuff. And so you're seeing even the big guys, even Jim Beam and Heaven Hill and Jack Daniels doing innovative whiskeys. And as that happens here in the United States, and as American whiskey captures more of the market here, you see Scotch distillers saying, yeah, we need to react, because not only are smaller producers coming around in the United States, they're starting to pop up in Scotland and doing innovative things. And the market is responding to that. People don't just want a decent blend to get them through the day, or their traditional single malt to get them through the day. They want to know what's cool, what's out there. When you show up at a bar like this, like Brandy Library, that really has the chops to present the range, you have people coming to the bar and saying, well, what's new this month? What's interesting this month? They don't want to ask for the thing they had last time.
We're going to do a speed round. Okay, so
God.
questions apply to both of you.
Oh, wait, I have to pretend I'm knowledgeable now?
Question number 1. What bottle are you most excited about right now?
Little Book from Jim Beam. So this is Freddie No. He's Fred No's son, Booker No's grandson. Booker's is the traditional, one of the big guy, barrel-proof whiskeys from Jim Beam. This is Freddie No's first product, and it is just supple and fascinating and big. It's not a bourbon. It's a mixture of a bunch of different whiskeys. It's barrel proof, and it is the thing that I reach for when I go home right now.
How about you, Dylan?
I'm firmly in love with the Jefferson's bourbon experiments, just as far as every time they're taking chances. But I mean, personally, I have more of a salty, savory profile. I don't really care for sweet things. So the Ocean series, which just has that like salted caramel toffee, is right up my alley. And strictly from a behind the bar, getting in front of the masses standpoint, I actually really like the Jameson Caskmate series, just as far as it's getting people who normally go to the bar and buy the same thing every night. It's just kind of like a great entry point to get people into taking a risk, something that they wouldn't normally go for.
Okay, next question. Your desert island whiskey. You can only have one. What'll it be? Go for it, Clay.
I won't say one specifically, but I would take anything from Springbank. In an ideal world, Springbank would be understood to be the greatest distillery. They make just right down the line everything you can want. Yeah, Springbank is where it's at.
Wow, that's kind of a loaded question. Can we talk about the climate of the deserted island, or are we talking a desert island? Because I could also take some, like a pallet of water would probably be
You
really
may
good
choose
too.
your island.
I mean, look, I would love to name bottles that I've fallen in love with over the years, from the first time I tasted Auchincashin to, hell, a bottle of Angel's Envy and I would get along really well for a little while on a deserted island. But honestly, if I'm there with no food and water and there's no way I'm getting off of this island, I want that bottle of Powers Gold Label, because I've been drinking away my sorrows and celebrating successes to that bottle since I was old enough to drink, and only since then, never before. But yeah, let's stick with the classics.
What is your favorite whiskey-based cocktail? And I'll buy you a little time because we're drinking mine right now, the Boulevardier.
For me, I am a man of simple tastes. I am that extends my cocktails. An old-fashioned is the way it goes.
Nice, solid, classic.
Classic, not hard. I am horrible at making cocktails, but I can make a decent old-fashioned.
How about you, Dylan?
I'm actually going to riff off that and say I would also go with an old-fashioned.
Okay. I do love all of the Manhattan riffs. I mean, I like a Brooklyn, I like a Little Italy, all of those, straight up, lots of vermouth, lots of other things thrown in there,
You and I haven't gotten to drink together nearly enough, but you definitely seem like a spirit on spirit on spirit kind of person when it comes to...
I am. I like the stirred and boozy, yeah. And we can remedy that drinking together.
Oh, yeah.
It's like starting now. All of us. Okay. Thank you, Clay.
All right. Thank you.
This podcast is produced by Large Media, L-A-R-J Media. Wine Enthusiast is made possible by grapes, sunshine, and wine, and by the hard-working editors who bring you news and information on your favorite beverage every day. If you like what we're doing, share our podcast with your friends and give us a review on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. For more fun wine information, follow us on Twitter and Facebook at Wine Enthusiast.